Elena lived by one rule: status is everything. Standing on the sun-drenched pier in her $3,000 mink coat, she found her status offended by a girl in a dirt-stained hoodie sitting in her private slip. To Elena, the girl was a stray, a nuisance to be kicked. She didn't just insult the girl, she emptied her purse, tossing silver coins into the murky harbor water. "If you're hungry, dive," Elena sneered, laughing as she boarded her yacht. The girl didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply looked at Elena with eyes as cold as a shallow grave and whispered, "Keep the change. You're going to need it to pay the ferryman tonight." Elena dismissed it as the ramblings of a beggar. But 4 hours later, at the city's most exclusive gala, the atmosphere shifted. When the homeless girl walked into the ballroom, now draped in silk and flanked by the National Guard, Elena watched in horror as her husband, a man who murdered without blinking, dropped to his knees and kissed the girl's ring. The stray wasn't a beggar. She was the queen of the syndicate, and she had come to collect the debt Elena owed. The salt air at the private marina always smelled like money to Elena, a scent far sweeter than the expensive Chanel No. 5 clinging to her neck. She adjusted her sunglasses, the gold frames catching the harsh glare of the afternoon sun, and looked down the length of the wooden pier with a practiced sneer. To Elena, the world was divided into those who owned the yachts and those who scrubbed them. As the wife of Marco, the man who held the city's throat in his palm, she was the undisputed queen of this dock. Her 4-inch stilettos clicked sharply against the planks, a rhythmic warning of her approach, until she stopped abruptly. There, sitting on a weathered bench intended for members only, was a girl who looked like a smudge of dirt on a pristine canvas. She wore an oversized gray hoodie stained with grease and frayed at the cuffs. Her hair was a tangled mess of chestnut brown, and her boots were held together by little more than hope. Elena felt a surge of genuine physical revulsion. This was her private slip, her sanctuary, and it had been defiled by a common vagrant. "I don't recall this being a soup kitchen," Elena projected, her voice dripping with a calculated, icy venom. The girl didn't jump. She didn't even flinch. She slowly lifted her head, revealing a face that was remarkably calm, her eyes a deep, unsettling gray. This lack of fear only stoked the fire of Elena's irritation. "Are you deaf? I said move. People like you are an eyesore to those of us who actually pay to breathe this air." The girl remained silent, staring with a gaze so heavy it felt like a physical weight. Infuriated by the defiance, Elena reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a handful of loose silver coins. With a mocking laugh, she flicked her wrist, sending the change clattering across the wood and splashing into the dark, murky water of the harbor. "If you're so desperate for a handout, dive for it. It's more than you'll earn in a year of begging." As Elena turned to board her yacht, the girl finally spoke. Her voice was low, melodic, and terrifyingly steady. "Keep the change, Elena. You're going to need it to pay the ferryman tonight." Elena froze, a chill tracing her spine that the sun couldn't warm, before she forced a laugh and stepped onto the deck, never looking back. The estate was a fortress of marble and glass, perched high above the city like a hawk's nest. But tonight the air inside felt suffocating. Elena stepped into the grand foyer, still invigorated by the cruelty she had dispensed at the pier. She handed her fur coat to a trembling maid, her mind already drifting to which diamonds would best suit the evening's gala. However, the silence of the house was shattered by the frantic pacing of her husband Marco. He was in his study, a room usually defined by his cold, calculating authority, but now he looked like a man standing on the edge of a jagged cliff. His silk tie was loosened, his face flushed with a sickly pallor that Elena had never seen before. "You're late," Marco snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was replaced by a frantic, vibrating tremor. He didn't even look at her, his eyes fixed on a decrypted folder on his desk. Elena rolled her eyes, gliding toward the crystal decanter to pour herself a stiff drink. She let the amber liquid swirl, her movements languid and bored. She told him he was being dramatic and mentioned that she had encountered a disgusting little stray at the docks who had ruined her mood. She laughed, expecting him to join in on the ridicule of the lower class, but Marco slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk, making the glassware rattle. "Forget the docks, Elena. Listen to me," he hissed. leaning over the desk with desperate intensity. He explained that word had come down from the highest level of the syndicate. The Shadow Sovereign, the ghost who ruled their entire world from the darkness, was sending an heir to evaluate their territory. This wasn't a routine check, it was a trial. One wrong move, one perceived slight, and their entire empire would be burned to the ground before sunrise. He paced again, muttering about respect and the absolute power of the founding family. Elena merely sipped her drink, a mocking smile playing on her lips. She scoffed at his terror, convinced that their wealth made them untouchable. To her, power was a loud, visible thing, not a shadow. She told him to calm himself, unaware that the shadow he feared had already looked her in the eyes and watched her throw coins into the sea. The grime on Mia's face was a masterpiece of deception, a blend of charcoal and grease that had successfully hidden the lineage carved into her cheekbones. As she stepped into the sterile, high-security safe house hidden behind a nondescript storefront, she shed the oversized, tattered hoodie like a snake outgrowing a useless skin. The girl who had sat on the pier, enduring Elena's venomous insults, disappeared with every layer of discarded rags. In her place stood a woman whose posture commanded the room before she even spoke a word. Two silent, suited men stood at attention, holding a basin of warm, scented water and a silk towel. As she scrubbed the artificial soot from her skin, the gray eyes that had unsettled Elena now burned with a terrifying, sharpened clarity. The homeless girl was a phantom, a test Mia had devised to measure the soul of this city's leadership. She had spent a week in the gutters, watching how the powerful treated the invisible, and the results had been damning. Elena had provided the final, definitive piece of evidence. Mia looked at her reflection, seeing the faint redness on her skin where the salt air had bitten, but she felt no pain, only a cold, clinical sense of duty. She was not preparing for a party, she was preparing a gallows. While Elena was likely drowning herself in perfumes and draped in stolen sunlight, Mia chose a different armor. She stepped into a tailored black power suit, the fabric so dark it seemed to swallow the light. She ignored the tray of diamonds her assistants offered, pushing aside the emeralds and the heavy gold chains that women like Elena used to scream their status. Mia required no such baubles to project her worth. Instead, she reached for a simple, heavy signet ring, the seal of the Shadow Sovereign. She slipped it onto her finger, the cold metal a silent promise of the reckoning to come. She thought of the coins at the bottom of the harbor, resting in the silt, and a ghost of a smile touched her lips. Arrogance was a debt that always collected interest, and Elena had spent the afternoon racking up a bill she could never hope to pay. Mia adjusted her cuffs, signaled for her escort, and stepped toward the waiting black SUV, the judge ready to deliver her final, crushing sentence. The ballroom of the Grand Excelsior was a cathedral of excess, dripping in gold leaf and illuminated by chandeliers that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. As Elena stepped through the arched entryway, she felt the familiar rush of eyes turning toward her. She was a vision in blood-red silk, her neck draped in diamonds that felt like cold fire against her skin. This was her domain, the place where her status was solidified by the envious glances of other women and the deferential nods of powerful men. She expected the night to follow its usual rhythm: champagne, flattery, and the quiet satisfaction of being at the apex of the social pyramid. But as she moved deeper into the room, the atmosphere felt heavy, like the air before a devastating summer storm. The music was a low, haunting cello melody that didn't quite cover the frantic whispers echoing in the corners. Elena noticed that the usual laughter was missing. Instead, the city's most ruthless men who normally carried themselves with the swagger of kings, were huddled in tight, tense circles. Their faces were pale, their eyes constantly darting toward the heavy oak doors at the back of the hall. The security was unlike anything she had ever seen. Silent, stony-faced men in tactical gear stood every 10 feet, their presence a stark, aggressive contrast to the tuxedoed guests. It didn't feel like a celebration. It felt like a silent gathering of the condemned awaiting a verdict. Marco was nowhere to be seen, likely tucked away in a private lounge trying to settle his fraying nerves. Elena gripped her crystal flute tighter, her knuckles turning white. She tried to catch the eye of a high-ranking lieutenant's wife, but the woman looked right through her, her face a mask of pure terror. The arrogance that had fueled Elena at the pier began to curdle into a cold, creeping unease. She remembered the girl's gray eyes and the way she had whispered about the ferryman. Elena shook her head, trying to banish the thought, but the tension in the room was a physical weight pressing against her chest. She took a long, desperate swallow of champagne, her gaze fixed on the entrance. Something was coming, something that made the monsters of this city tremble, and for the first time in her life, Elena felt utterly and terrifyingly small. The heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom didn't just open. They were cast wide with a deliberate, booming finality that silenced the cello's mournful strain mid-note. The air in the room seemed to vanish, sucked out by a vacuum of pure, unadulterated power. Standing in the threshold was a figure silhouetted against the bright hallway lights, a sharp and lethal contrast to the gilded decadence of the hall. It was the girl. But the homeless, stray from the pier, had been completely replaced by a sovereign of shadows. Mia stepped forward, her black power suit absorbing the glow of the chandeliers, her gait steady and predatory. She didn't look at the crowd. She looked through them, her gray eyes as cold and unforgiving as the Atlantic in midwinter. Elena's heart didn't just race, it hammered against her ribs with the force of a trapped bird. The champagne flute slipped from her numb fingers, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that seemed as loud as a gunshot in the oppressive silence. She expected the guards to move, expected someone to challenge this intruder, but what happened next was far more terrifying. As Mia reached the center of the room, Marco, the man who ruled this city with an iron fist, the man Elena had seen break dozens of rivals, moved with a sudden, desperate agility. He didn't just greet her, he collapsed. His knees hit the floor with a heavy thud, and he bowed his head so low his forehead nearly touched his polished shoes. Following his lead, a wave of motion rippled through the room. One by one, the most dangerous men in the state dropped to the ground, their silk suits wrinkling as they offered the ultimate sign of submission. The silence was now deafening, broken only by the ragged breathing of the terrified elite. Elena stood alone, a splash of arrogant red in a sea of kneeling black. The realization hit her like a physical blow to the stomach, knocking the wind from her lungs. This wasn't just a guest. This was the Shadow Sovereign's blood. She had mocked, insulted, and thrown trash at the one person who held the power to erase her name from history. The ferryman had arrived, and Elena realized with a sickening jolt that she was already standing on the wrong side of the river. Mia did not raise her voice, yet her words cut through the suffocating stillness like a serrated blade. With a subtle tilt of her head, she fixed her gaze on Elena, who stood frozen amidst a sea of kneeling titans. "Stand before me," Mia commanded, and the sheer weight of the authority in her tone forced Elena's trembling legs to move. The crowd of criminals, men who had spilled blood for a fraction of the power now radiating from the girl in the black suit, watched with bated breath. Elena stumbled into the center of the ballroom, her red silk dress suddenly looking like a garish costume of a fool rather than the robes of a queen. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that magnified the sound of Mia reaching into her pocket. Slowly, Mia opened her hand. Resting in her palm were the silver coins Elena had tossed into the harbor, still dull from the salt and smelling of the murky depths. "Earlier today at the pier, a woman told me that I was an eyesore," Mia began, her voice a melodic poison that traveled to every corner of the hall. "She told me that her air was expensive and that I was a parasite for breathing it. She threw these coins into the water and told me to dive for my dinner." A collective gasp seemed to die in the throats of the onlookers. Marco, still on his knees, turned a shade of gray that matched the stone floor, his eyes darting toward his wife with a mixture of loathing and primal fear. Mia looked down at Marco, her expression one of clinical curiosity. "Your wife believes that wealth is a license for cruelty, Marco. She believes that because she wears your name, she is above the laws of respect that govern our world." She dropped the coins one by one. They hit the marble floor with a sharp, rhythmic ping that echoed like a funeral bell. "The syndicate does not tolerate those who draw unwanted attention through petty arrogance. So I give you a choice, Marco. You can walk out of this room as a boss, or you can stay here as a husband, but you cannot be both. Marco didn't hesitate. He didn't even look at Elena as he whispered his betrayal, choosing his life over the woman who had doomed them both. The verdict hung in the air, heavier than the massive crystal chandeliers that now felt like a cage of light. Elena reached out a hand toward Marco, a silent, desperate plea for a shred of the loyalty she had assumed was her birthright, but he pulled away as if her touch were a terminal contagion. He kept his head bowed, his silence a signature on her death warrant. Mia stepped closer, the clicking of her heels the only sound in the vast, gilded tomb. She did not look at Elena with hatred. That would have implied Elena still mattered. Instead, she looked at her with the cold, detached indifference one might show to a broken piece of furniture that was finally being cleared away to make room for something far more useful. "You built your life on the backs of people you refused to see," Mia whispered, her voice reaching every corner of the frozen ballroom. "Tonight, I grant you your wish. You will be exactly what you feared most." With a subtle gesture to the security team, Mia signaled the beginning of the end. 2 guards stepped forward, and with efficient, brutal precision, they began to strip the symbols of Elena's stolen power. They unclasped the diamond necklace from her throat, the stones catching the light one last time before being dropped into a velvet bag. They slid the heavy gold rings from her trembling fingers. Even her blood-red silk wrap was taken, leaving her exposed and shivering in the center of the hall. She was no longer the wife of a titan. She was a woman whose name had been erased. Mia reached down and gathered the salt-stained coins from the floor, pressing them into Elena's palm and closing her fingers around them with a grip like iron. "This is your entire net worth now, Elena. Use it wisely." The guards turned Elena around and marched her toward the exit. As she passed the rows of guests, people she had dined with and looked down upon for years, not a single eye met hers. She was already a ghost, a shadow moving through a world that had forgotten her existence before she even reached the door. Elena stumbled out into the cold night, the heavy oak doors booming shut behind her. Inside, Mia turned back to the room and ascended the dais, taking her seat on the high-backed throne. She sat in the darkness, the true sovereign, finally home,